Are we ready? Okay. All right. Welcome everyone to our 2025 CSDE seminar. Welcome to all of our new students. Welcome to new faculty. Really excited about this this year's seminar series. I think we're almost full for the year, so that's pretty exciting. Thanks to everybody who helped connect us with other people. I'm really delighted about this quarter in particular, but I've been reflecting a bit about our seminar series in relation to other population research seminar series. And I have to say, I'm going to look at Kyle to see if he would agree with me, and Natalie. But I think we have one of the most creative interdisciplinary demography seminars in the country. And I think one of the things about demography, one of the ways in which I think demography is going to be evolving in the future is being far more context, place-based, specific in how we understand and measure and operationalize models and the like, and as well as historically sensitive to how we understand measurement and categories and the like. So I'm really proud of all of us, and it's a lot to do with who we are here in our community at UW. And so when you are out and about and thinking about who we are and what our community is, you should be proud to be part of this, I think. And I'm really grateful for everything you've done. And one of the reasons why I think we've been able to make that transition towards a much more interdisciplinary, sensitive context, historically sensitive approach to demography is because our seminar series chair is also. And Rowan Arar, I'm really happy for her to have taken this up for the third year. And I'll turn it over to her for announcements now. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So wonderful to see you all again. It's something I've really been looking forward to with the start of the year. I just have a few quick announcements for you all. First, if you are a student in 501 and you want credit for being here, make sure that you sign in. We also have some really exciting workshops and presentations coming up. There is a probabilistic population projections 1 theory, which is on October 7th at 10 a.m. And I'm sure you'll see this in your emails. There's also the second version of that, which is on October 9th, also at 10 a.m. And then this quarter, you'll see that Susan Brown is coming for the Pete Guest lecture. Susan Brown is a demographer who also works on migration. I had the chance to meet her as a graduate student. She gave incredible advice, was so kind. So I highly, highly recommend that you sign up to meet with her. I'll be reaching out to folks if you want to send me an email you can also access it online. Maddie has made the sign-up sheet available. And of course, grad students will have a chance to meet with Susan Brown as well after her presentation. So she's coming October 17th, and we would love it if we can fill her schedule and have her meet all of us, or as many of us as possible. And with that, I will hand over the mic to Natalie, who's going to do introductions today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we talk about our speakers today, I just want to give a round of applause and thanks to Rowan Arar, who, when we're I see a little bit behind the scenes of what she does to make this all happen all year long. And it's a lot when the rest of us are sleeping in at the end of summer. So thank you so much. But now to today's panel, it will be centered on housing precarity and eviction. Our first presenter here is Dr. Tim Thomas, who is Chief Research and Data Officer at the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, KCRHA, if you talk about it like that. Also notably, he's the founder of the Eviction Research Network, which you can look up and get more information on for your own work as well. His research focuses primarily on eviction and housing insecurity. He's published widely in journals such as City and Community, Social Science Medicine, and PLOS One, to name just a few. In addition, his work has informed policymakers at all levels of government, including the White House, HUD, and Treasury Department. And you can ask him later whether his White House advising is the current one or the past one. And on a much more local level, Dr. Thomas is an alum of the UW Sociology PhD program and the CSDE certificate program, which makes us very happy to have him back. Welcome back. Our second presenter is over there, Will Van Geldern. Will is currently a PhD candidate at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, so he's also one of our community here at home. His work focuses broadly on the effects of public policies and legal systems on the health and well-being of marginalized communities, with specific focus on evictions. He has already published as a PhD candidate in social science and medicine in the Stanford Law and Policy Review. And like Dr. Thomas, Van Geldern's work also contributes to the academic and public spheres, most notably through published policy reports, including on evictions in Washington State. So thank you both for joining us. I'll pass it off to Dr. Thomas.
I get that set up. It's an honor to be here. I never thought I would be back in this space, especially being so white. I remember when it was pretty, a lot more echoey. So it is still kind of echoey, but I think we can work with it. My name's Tim. I got my PhD in 2017 and was actually a postdoc at the Science Institute located in South Campus, where we did a lot of work on linking HMIS data, homelessness management information system data, to public housing data. And I had spent a lot of time frustrating Kyle, I think, because I kept getting into the public sphere and doing, things and turning in papers late and things like that. But I got really excited about how science, social science in particular, and demography can really inform population impact. And I got into data science and learned a lot at the East Science Institute. Obviously learned a lot at the sociology department and demography department, one of the most foundational experiences I ever had. And a lot of the things that I learned actually in the CSDE and demography in particular helps inform a lot of the work that I've done before. Basically, where are people at? What's happening to them? How can we help them in certain circumstances? And how can we provide better evidence in predicting what can be done or what should be done in certain circumstances? So before I go too far, this is my NASCAR hood of partners. I have to like to thank professors on the left from UC Berkeley, Berkeley Institute of Data Science, Institute of Governmental Studies, also Legal Services Corp. I won't go down the full list. Universities, different providers that have helped with this work that largely kind of started in 2013 when I was asked to do a case for the ACLU on estimating the gender and race identity of individuals that are facing eviction. We use natural language processing to go through court records, pull out, extract addresses with a location, basically a census tract location and a last name. You can estimate race with a pretty good accuracy. And what that did is helped win several cases and also motivated some Washington state policy change. And as I got into the data collection, it kind of became evident that eviction data is hard to kind of process. And these tools that we've learned here, especially this generation, I would say, of computational social scientists, as we'll call them, computational demographers, is kind of the needed generation that we have. And so groups like this seek out people like you and like me, needing to be informed through this. So my talk today, hopefully won't take too long, is kind of a roughshod book proposal that I have. So I apologize if a little bit is off. But I want to start with the concept of kind of settling us on what drives displacement. What I want to talk about is, let's rethink about what we think about displacement. Let's think specifically about it. So by and large, we know that rising rents, housing costs, eviction and foreclosure, infrastructure and transit projects all can spur things like gentrification, can press people to leave places where they don't want to leave, force some people out. And then there's also kind of the dynamics such as legacy of redlining and discriminatory policies where, you know, even a city doing its best job of trying to do a crime prevention in a Black neighborhood may turn someplace like, I don't know, 23rd and Union into one of the most high cost areas when it was a 30-year open air drug market prior to 2010, right? Gentrification can be spurred by any individual. It's largely driven by the market. It usually takes a long time, but where does displacement fall in gentrification? It tends to fall prior to, displacement falls prior to gentrification in a lot of places. Now, to displace someone, you need a population that is needing to be displaced, right? This is where legacies of redlining and discrimination kind of come into play. There's a lot of compound vulnerabilities amongst folks who are displaced. Multiple drivers overlap, intensifying displacement. And also there's just the big problem of housing shortages. Where do people go? Where do they end up living? And I highly recommend reading any kind of literature, specifically on segregation literature, because it's about migration. It's about driving people into certain spaces based on whether or not people can afford to move to a certain space, whether or not they have networks that they're familiar with, or they're familiar with an area. There are ways to tie all this together. Now, this is all shotgun kind of information, about 16 classes run in one slide here. But what we don't know very much, if you look at this, this is a lot to untangle, isn't it? It's a lot to try and swallow at one time. And what I would like to challenge us to do is to think about just displacement, not gentrification, the post-displacement era, not stably wealthy neighborhoods, but just for a moment, let's think about the context of displacement. This is a lot to swallow. And I want to ask us, how do we classify the nuances of displacement? And how do we quantify displacement risk? So let's start that basic demography. This is a mobility curve that basically highlights this theoretical context about who is getting displaced and when, okay? So on the bottom axis is economic status. On the right-hand side is low income. On the left-hand side is high income. The little smiley face kind of tells you a little bit about the high or low residential mobility possibility of individuals. So if you look on the far right-hand side, you got a full upswing. People who are wealthy can go where they want, when they want. They can do what they want. So they're highly mobile. But people in the middle section, middle income individuals, if not people at, say, area median income, are less mobile, right? They don't have the expenses necessarily to go places, and maybe they want to stay there. Maybe they got lucky and bought a house before 2020, who knows? But if you look on the left-hand side, we have lower income folks who are now forced to move, and that's the population that we know least about. Now, this is the group of people that get displaced. Now, I want you to take another look, and remember the previous slide, it's a little bit complicated. Rental markets are playing a big role, things like that. But let's just kind of sit down and think about two slices of this group, this population. Hard displaced and soft displaced. Hard displacement is when we do not have the option to stay where we're at. This is what eviction does. This is what renovations out of our control do. Soft displacement, on the other hand, let's say we're making about $80,000 in Seattle and we're just not really comfortable paying the rents that we are paying, right? We could afford it, maybe, you know, it's just kind of a light pressure, but I have a choice. In the red side, we don't have a choice. So let's take an example here of displacement risk classification. This is based off a lot of the research that I've done over the past several years. And I like to think about those that are tending to be soft displaced tend to fall within the 50 to 80% AMI area median income, all right? So in Seattle's case, the area median income as of 2023 is $122,000. 80% AMI which is also considered low income, according to HUD standards, is roughly about 97,600. 50% AMI, very low income, is about 61,000. And then 30% AMI, which is considered extremely low income, is 36,600. Now, folks that fall below 80% AMI can start to qualify for HUD subsidies, but especially folks that fall between 50 and 30% AMI definitely qualify for that. The people in 30% AMI tend to start getting housing choice vouchers, this kind of stuff. But this is the population that what we have found is that those that fall below 50% AMI tend to be at the hardest risk of eviction. They can't afford the rents, losing jobs. They're very much subject to the market at hand. They have little control over what they have. Now, if we look on the bottom right-hand side, we look at Seattle rents. I just looked this up today. Roughly, it's about average, it's about $2,200. If you kind of do a calculation to avoid rent burden, which is 30% of the income going towards rent, you need to make about $88,000 in Seattle to afford the average rent. If you want a 2-bedroom, you're looking closer to $3,000 and require $120,000. Now, this to y'all, I apologize, this may come across as too simple, but this is kind of one of the ways that we have to kind of translate this scientific information for the public, for policy to understand this. So I just want to pay, kind of note that if you want to get into policy, we have to distill complex information into tangible things. You need an 88K to live in Seattle, basically, on average. Now, if you look on the left-hand side, who falls within 88K, it's going to be roughly about 70% AMI. So there's still some affordability, but that kind of shows us there's potentially a lot of people that are at risk. And in the state of Washington, half of people are rent burdens, and 25%, or actually half of the half, 25% of the total, are extremely rent burdened, paying more than 50% of their income, right? We're starting to get an idea of like what population size might be at risk of some form of displacement. So I was in DC one time and I was talking to the director of HUD, not the current one either, the research director. And he told me, he said that all we need in government are tools to help us make a decision. And I started kind of fashioning around that and thinking about that. It's like, okay, we have some pretty cool models where we could actually predict eviction risk with a little bit of information. We could also predict displacement risk, especially if we have these two types now. And we start thinking about it. And so I created something called the housing precarity risk model over the past couple of years. It's gone through a couple of iterations. And what it does is it takes a combination of eviction data and displacement data. Eviction data is our hard displacement data, right? Needing to understand the nuance that not everybody is at risk of eviction, but who might be at risk of eviction is very important in making policy decisions. So I happen to have I had more than 5 years, but I used about 5 years of eviction data from 2015 to 2019 across 17 states, household level. That covered most of the regions I was happy with. Midwest, we actually had some West Coast data because there's nuance in terms of how the United States kind of is, right? It's very different in the South, it's very different in the Northwest, it's very different in the Northeast. And I collected this data across several different sources. And I used a model called a Bayesian additive regression tree, which is basically a machine learning model that has a Bayesian generalizer. Hey,
Welcome back.
Thank you. He actually helped a lot with all this. Had to see. I love that guy. Actually, I remember working on the eviction data for, across the area. So one thing that we could do in terms of trying to find a prediction model is we can take as much information as possible, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. And our traditional frequency statistical ways kind of are limited in what we can kind of add into it. But with the advancements of computational power and advancements into machine learning and to Bayesian statistics, we can actually try to look at a large set of data across many, many dimensional areas. So we took eviction data across these areas, and we took about 600 neighborhood characteristics and fed them into this model, reduced it down to the primary variables that were driving eviction at the neighborhood census tract level, okay? So what that does is it provides us, after comparing it, I think I'm giving a talk at the computational demography where I'll go into more of the details of the math behind all this stuff. But for the layperson, what it does is it allows us to take that data, use the predict fit on this, and put it in places where we don't have eviction data. In other words, we can use the prediction from this model. And for example, we don't have any information in Idaho. So we can make a fuzzy prediction of sorts of like, okay, where would we expect the risk of eviction to be higher or lower based on these, what ended up being about 80 variables, rent data, demographic data, policy data, all sorts of stuff that you could just throw at it. We also developed a displacement measure, which is basically, which I didn't put down in here, is the net migration rate of low-income individuals who are moving in and out of neighborhoods, right? Net migration, if you have more low-income people moving out, we kind of categorize that as displacement. If you have more low-income people moving in, we categorize that as some sort of growth, but we're focused on the displacement. In other words, the net migration of individuals moving out below 80% AMI. We actually broke it into 30, 50, and 80% AMI, but that's getting into the weeds a little bit. And we use data axle data. It's a proprietary data set that's commercial that I highly discourage people from using. But if you use it correctly, you can. And the way that we attempted to use it was that if you look at the data as a whole, it's just like the averages are wonky, right? So we use a sampling strategy, and we use the US Census to identify, here's how many people we have at below 80% AMI, and then here's a census tract with data axle data, the same one, and we tried to see if we had enough samples to kind of pull something out of this data. We then broke up the United States into multiple regions. This kind of took a while to figure it out, and we can define the US in a lot of different ways, but I kind of found this crazy website that I kind of like called objectivelist.com that talked about this concept of a socio-demographic cohesion within certain regions. And they actually made this map, which I kind of manipulated a little bit. And I don't know, I was kind of cool with it. People from Oregon maybe are more similar than similar with California than they are from Georgia, right? And so the different shaded areas kind of highlight the similarities in that. Now, the reason why I had to break it up into different regions and not just throw all the United States into a model is because my computer choked at about 50 million people. So I had to kind of do some computational wiggling and broke up this using the similar BART model on each region within each area to kind of measure what were the predictors of net migration, loss of low-income households. In other words, net migration, out-migration of low-income households. Within each of those areas, modeled it for each of those spaces between the period of 2015 and 2019, and came up with a fit. So we have hard displacement, which is eviction data, soft displacement, which is the low-income displacement data. We have a modeling strategy, basically parsing this BART model across hard and soft displacement. It's a really useful model, non-parametric approach to it, which I'm not a fan of in some ways because there are some issues with some parts of that. But the results end up with a estimated displacement risk, estimated eviction risk, and composite score HGRM across the whole United States. And so basically, we tried to simplify this and pare it down. And here it is. So With this eviction risk model, how much more time do I have? Perfect. We've created a website. This is on a Git repository called, see if we can send out this link somewhere. But this is on a GitHub, and we ran the model on 2019 data. So actual eviction data from 2019, and the data axle data was from, well, 2015 to 2019, a 5-year period that overlapped. And then we didn't have data axle data, and we couldn't trust the US Census, and, well, not the census, but we didn't have eviction data for certain periods. We kind of lost a lot. So we just took the fit from 2019 and applied it to 2022 census data to get something as close as we could. We also did some ground truthing, comparing this to other people, other individuals' assumptions of this. And so we come up with this map, zooms in to Seattle. I'm actually going to take us to San Francisco to kind of show a point. It also, we limited census tracts to tracts that had about 50 people per square kilometer at least. So it's kind of mostly urban, but it was kind of surprising. So this right here kind of shows you the overall Bay Area. And what it does is it highlights what is at risk, elevated, higher, extreme. Cutoffs are a science of their own. We can go into that later. And what it does is it actually did a really good job of highlighting where were high precarity areas, extreme precarity areas. This is West Oakland, traditionally segregated, and it's going through extreme displacement, right? They would love to gentrify that place, but they have to get rid of the vulnerable people first, right? So they're working very hard to displace these areas. This area down here is called Fruitvale. It likely will not gentrify. It's a little too black and brown for the market. I'm being facetious, but in reality, when you work in certain spaces within this space, there are two things that kind of delay gentrification: crime and diversity. You get rid of both of those, you start to see gentrification fully take over, right? And that's kind of the inequality that happens within gentrification. We can get into that later. So this is the overall HPRM risk. This is the combination of both eviction and displacement risk. But here's something that was kind of tricky. San Francisco actually has incredibly strong eviction prevention. And it actually pops up in this map. I didn't try to do this, but the model kind of picked it up, which was nice. But it is, as the kids say, hella expensive in San Francisco. And so there's a lot more displacement that kind of happens. Now, what's something that you notice about between these two maps? Eviction and displacement are not one and one. Remember, we're talking about this peanut butter sandwich of information is really two kind of unique phenomenon that are going on. So what I would like to do, if the one thing that you walk away from this is challenge you to think about two things. One, always think about intersectionality. I didn't talk about that much, but kind of add that into your dictionary. But let's not talk about displacement as just displacement, right? 50% AMI, low-income households are facing challenges that are a different rate than what we see for folks that are between 50 and 80% AMI. And what this helps us do is it helps us disentangle, okay, when we're doing cancer research or we're doing some sort of other kind of assessment or analysis, we can actually kind of disentangle the true effects on who's really being impacted with that, right? We start to kind of use this type of information to hone in on population, subpopulation specifics, which provides us an opportunity to give policy recommendations at a much more granular level, right? So, kind of the big takeaway, we encourage you to use more advanced statistics to kind of get at fancy stuff. Let's look at our hometown here, Seattle. It's because we can't just walk away. We need to do this manually. If we have time, we could look at someplace like Baltimore. I forgot I have a search function in here anyway. So here is the overall housing precarity risk. Let's restart. The blue here kind of shows lower precarity. This is your Kirkland, Bellevue area. Forgot what this area is over here, but past Bellevue, and before Sammamish. But as you can see, that a lot of the housing precarity risk is down in South King County. So the left-hand side, if you hover on there, it shows you the diversity of an area. It shows the median income. It's about 58,000. Remember, our Seattle median income is 122,000. These people are struggling. More than half, very median income. 72% low income. This is all in the extreme area. And what we found, some of the research that I did prior, actually for my dissertation, was a lot of the evictions that happen now in the Seattle region and King County happen in South King County, because that's the destination where Black households have moved to since the great displacement, as I call it, from the Central District, which was the area where Black households were redlined in those certain spaces. The eviction risk, much higher, very high in the South. And the displacement risk is much higher in the core of Seattle, right? You can imagine how many people have tried to get a sweet house in Ballard recently. It's kind of hard, right? Or down in the downtown area. All those are areas that probably tenure to people with higher incomes, right? So it kind of fits within that model of the 50 to 80% AMI curve. And it's just, it's not overlapping necessarily. You're not seeing a lot of displacement risk down here, but you do see a lot of eviction risk. Now that's a whole nother talk about that distinction for low-income households, because there's a concept of churning that happens, that people keep facing eviction, whereas displacement in itself, eviction is a form of displacement, but it's happening to population. So I said last time I was here that I'm a doom demographer. So here's some of the cool graphs that can come out of BART models, kind of showing you very, very distinct situations of, for example, where evictions happen when it is tract percent Black is close to zero. There's close to zero evictions, but even when it gets up to about 8%, you start to see a massive increase. These are very useful models. Rents are getting higher. And I said that this talk was, how do we measure displacement in a post-pandemic era? This is something that is new to us. The trends that were happening prior to the pandemic, here's 2020 right here. A lot of them were lower, but right around 21, we see in King County, which is a mostly urban mixed with a ton of forest, but lots of urban. In urban spaces, this happened in San Francisco too, you see like the trend, and then all of a sudden dips because people just kind of like, stayed in place, or the market just kind of froze, but then it just kind of got to normal. But every county around, in California, in the South, everywhere else, that is more rural per se, or not super urban, doesn't have a major urban core, saw nothing but an increase in rent. So even Benton County, which is way out in Southeast Washington, saw a $334 increase from 2021 to towards the end of 2024. People can get evicted for $50. I mean, the pressure of displacement can happen at such a low rate. It's insane. One thing that I wanted to kind of pass off to you is something we're doing at KCRHA is, why do we have these tools? Well, we need to know if something bad is about to happen. And this is a graph that tells you something very bad is about to happen. In 2024, every 2 years, we conduct something like a census of folks who are unsheltered and sheltered. We call it the point in time count. And in 2024, we had 16,868 people split between sheltered and unsheltered, right? And it's roughly 50-50. So about 8,000 sheltered, 8,000 and change unsheltered. Thanks to Zach Almquist, so I blame him, professor in sociology, he's been forecasting that we're likely to see at least a 10% increase in our pit count just based on normal trends. It could get up to, if you look at the upper bounds, 85th percent, 95th percentile, 80th percentile, upwards towards 20,000 people total. That's just on the average day. That's like Trump not here, nothing's happening. But with what's going on, there are threats of the continuum of care, which is all HMI, homelessness dollars coming from the Fed being cut. That would add 5,000 people to our population here. And then on top of it, Section 8, rapid rehousing, things like that, would add another 5,000 people. So sometime between now and 2027, 2028, we have the risk of going from about 16,800 people to close to 30,000 people being at risk of homelessness. Where are those people going to be homeless? HPRM can help you identify some of those locations. So these are tools to help with policy. And with that, I'll pause and stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I will try to go fairly quickly so we have some time to talk about this. Thankfully, Tim covered a lot of the intro stuff already. So I will just start by saying thank you to all the collaborators you see here. My view of what I'm presenting is really that it's the product of all, years of collaborative work between government, researchers, nonprofits, and it's, although I'm the one presenting it, it really, I owe a debt of gratitude to a lot of other people who have come before me and who have collaborated with me on this research and also helped me understand data and access data and, you be able to do the research in the first place. So it's a big group and I won't name everyone, but I just want to share some appreciation first. Okay, so first, if you're familiar with sociological or demographic research on evictions, you've seen much of what Tim has presented. Evictions are rising, and typically in sociological research, you'll see a few terms mentioned. So I just wanted to define those terms first. So first, there's eviction filing rate, which is the number of eviction filings per renter occupied household. Eviction rate, which is the number of households that have a eviction judgment issued against them. So it's a smaller subset of those eviction filings. And then households threatened, which is sort of when you collapse it into a household level, how many households have received an eviction filing. So if you're reading eviction research, it's worth noting that what you're typically reading about, especially if you're looking at national data, and this is why I really appreciate what Tim has been doing, is most research is still using that measure of just eviction filings. So in my research, I've been trying to look at the Washington State Right to Counsel program, which provides legal assistance to folks who are going through an eviction. And I've been kind of stuck on this scale of there's the very high level research that uses administrative data, which have a lot of errors. And then what I've been doing is a lot more like working with RAs to hand code data and look for small sample sizes that are very meaningful and help develop theory. And so I've just been kind of caught in this middle ground of either we can answer, these big questions at a very large scale with, data that actually have a lot of inaccuracies based on when they've been double checked. And if you've looked through eviction data from county or state governments, there are just a lot of errors. There just really are. And then on the other hand, if you review case documents, you can get very precise measures with small sample sizes. So what I'm particularly interested in as well is, as Natalie mentioned in the intro, trying to understand what is the role of the legal system in creating certain outcomes, or reproducing people's experiences of poverty or housing insecurity after they experience an eviction filing. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions in all this eviction research about the heterogeneity of case outcomes, what happens in different cases, how likely is somebody to be evicted and what are the other outcomes that they might encounter as seen in legal documents. And then also the relationship between those case outcomes and, long-term housing insecurity. For example, if they have their record sealed, does that predict future housing, more, housing security in the future? Those questions are still just not really answered. And I'll show you a little bit more later, but those questions have obvious policy relevance because like not every eviction is created equal. And so we might be able to try to understand that relationship between eviction and displacement a little bit better if we understand the details. So a couple of things to note because I'm going to present data from Washington. First of all, we have a low eviction rate. I think if I ask people in this room, does Washington have a high eviction rate or a low eviction rate? Probably most people would not say we have one of the lowest eviction rates. But that's just something to keep in mind. There are a lot of, there's a lot of ways that people get displaced, and evictions are one of them. But that's also, for example, landlords have to pay a filing fee to initiate a court-ordered eviction. And depending on how expensive those are, that sort of goes into the calculus of whether some type of displacement or harassment to, predicate displacement turns into an actual court-ordered eviction. So, for example, I just thought this was really interesting. If you look at the top 100 large cities, mid-sized cities, small cities, and rural areas, there's no Washington jurisdictions in any of those around the country. I just found that a little bit surprising. And particularly in this presentation, I'm focusing on data from Pierce County because it's just sort of like the highest quality and most accessible. And it has one of the state's highest eviction rates, so there's a lot of data. It has high quality data. And then the eviction procedures, like the case procedures, are pretty typical of Washington state and also of other jurisdictions. And I'm happy to talk more about that. So the quantitative data that I'm going to present, I'll show a little diagram of it here. But it's basically Tim and his team helped me access 195,000 PDF documents, which is all of the documents that were filed in all of the eviction cases in Pierce County from 2022 to 2024. And they're just like PDFs in folders that have been labeled. And then I also have some qualitative evidence that I may run out of time to present, but I'm happy to talk about. So this was like the best diagram I could come up with to figure out what I did this summer. But basically you can see there's 8,500 cases. Within those, there's the 195,000 PDFs, and then using Microsoft's like Azure AI suite, I did optical character recognition on every one of those documents, which basically turns every document into an observation that has, a document name and then a long string of text, which could be up to, 200,000 characters, or it could be, 1,000 characters. And it's just like everything is turned into a string of text. From that, I used something called retrieval augmented generation, which is basically feeding a prompt or a pattern into an LLM. In this case, I used one of the ChatGPT models, and then I cross-checked it with some of the hand coding that my RAs have been doing to try to understand like how precise this is. And so you can see just by looking at the documents, I was able to get basically 95% accuracy. In particular, you can do that in Pierce County, while you probably couldn't do that in other counties. And then once you use the LLM, you can get up to 96, 97, and getting close to 98% alignment with hand coding. And I actually think there's a few low-hanging fruit that I can even use to get that a little bit higher. So I would say this is pretty precise data. As I mentioned, previous studies just look at like eviction filings, eviction judgments. To some extent, we can estimate race based on geography and names. And I want to sort of like open up these cases a little bit and try to see what's really going on. So I wanted to look at rates of dismissals, record sealing orders, which are called orders of limited dissemination, agreements, and what happens in those agreements, rates of legal representation, and then also like when somebody has a judgment, but it's overturned, and then what happens after that. And one thing that I'll present today, which is just a small snapshot of this project, is something called the court displacement rate. And a lot of studies have used this eviction rate to try to understand what percentage of cases have an eviction judgment issued. But in a lot of cases, there will be an agreement that says, there's no writ of restitution issued, which is sort of the legal term for an eviction document, but the tenant has to move out in the next 3 weeks. And, you can sort of think like, is that better or worse than a writ of eviction? It's probably a little bit better. How much better is it? I'm not really sure. Either way, the eviction's on your record, at least in Washington state, and you still have to move, and maybe you get an extra week or two. So is that really a very successful outcome for the tenant? I'm not exactly sure. So the first thing is just looking at the overall case counts. This is from 2022 to 2020, the end of 2024. And this is pretty much, this is going to be the same data that Tim has showed. And you can just see there's like some seasonal variation, but overall, as we come out of the COVID moratorium, the eviction moratorium and the bridge moratorium that was in Washington, evictions are on the rise. And then I also looked at this court displacement. So previous studies have shown that court displacement, like in Boston, is around 45%. In New York City, it's more like 10%. In New Orleans, it's 61%. So it's kind of all over the place. Washington, and this that I found here is among the highest that I've seen anywhere. So 73% of cases resulted in either a judgment against the tenant or an agreement for the tenant to move. And this is in a state where we have right to counsel. We have, legal representation appointed for about half of cases. And you can see although this might be obvious, the court displacement rate is higher than the judgment rate. This is not literally true because court displacement does not automatically include every eviction judgment because some eviction judgments are overturned. And what I'm measuring is the final eviction judgment. But you can see that basically this shows if you're just measuring displacement through eviction judgments, you're probably underestimating. And if you're measuring it through cases filed, you're probably overestimating. And then I'll just leave this last slide here because we have about 10 minutes for discussion. But I also looked at court displacement rate by whether or not a tenant had an attorney. And you can see there's a difference in the bottom part of the panel in whether or not somebody was represented and whether they have an eviction judgment issued. But in the top panel, it's really kind of hard to distinguish meaningful, consistent variation in whether representation translates to court displacement. So this is why I said this measure might be a little bit, more policy relevant, because this sort of points to the fact that like maybe tenant representation isn't a good way to prevent displacement, even if it is valuable in other ways. And I'm not making that statement causally, but it's just a surprising figure that I just wanted to put up here. This is only based on 2 years of data in a place with very high rent, a lot of housing. So I will skip the qualitative data for now and just say thank you, and then we can have a conversation. Thanks. The summary of everything else. All right. Please.
I'm a UF alum, but I actually was in analysis there. Wondering, you guys have talked about like, using these data on policy institutions. Like, what are some unique ways how to try to improve outcomes?
If you look at,
Question is basically, what sort of
I'm trying to remember his. So what policies, what helpful policies might be applied to help prevent evictions roughly? Yeah. Well, in the terms of data, right? So there's a couple of hot, policies out there. Just cause, which is basically a speed bump to slow, like ensuring you have a reason to evict somebody, like you fell behind on rent. It's kind of shocking. That's not like, a demand already. But right to counsel, which is what you've been working on a lot, Office of Civil Legal Aid in Washington State actually did a pilot and has continued to do this pilot. It's been funded, and it has shown representation. I'm just saying this because I did the pre-pandemic period. Representation was roughly 2%. Upwards, like King County had up to 25% representation because they had a group called the Housing Justice Project that was located in the courts. And since the pilot, there's been roughly 90-something% representation. And of the representation, those that get represented through the Office of Civil Legal Aid, 83% have actually found stable housing after eviction. and 53% of that 80-something percent are still housed in the house they were being evicted from, right? Now, to your point, you said, right to counsel isn't necessarily the smoking gun. This is just helping the individual know their rights and face representation. So any person can realize, well, it doesn't solve the economic problem. It doesn't solve the sociodemographic or whatever problem, doesn't solve the landlord problem necessarily. So it helps us kind of stay housed, but this is where I was encouraging intersectionality on this context, where we have to think about, okay, now that you've saved them from this eviction, how do we save them from the next eviction or that kind of thing too? And that's where the research is needing to head into. So looking at longitudinal information. But the policies, they work. Any policy really, any tenant policy really works, has some sort of effect. It's just that when it all comes down to it, it's just the classic age problem of this is about poverty. This is about economic inequality. And once we solve that, that's really getting at that. So pre-eviction stuff would be really important policies to consider. We just finished a study with HUD looking at the effectiveness of emergency rental assistance, and direct to landlord rental assistance had massive effects in keeping people housed during the pandemic. Renter assistance is honestly like one of the biggest ones that I think would be a policy that everyone should try to adopt, which is the hardest one. I mean, we're not going to have another moratorium. That was by far the most effective, but yeah.
Yeah, and overall, like I agree with everything that Tip just said. And I think what research is particularly helpful for is sort of like breaking populations, or in this case, like evictions, into smaller subsets. So that's why I've been trying to look at some of these case outcomes. Is like, what are the types of households that are having that are being displaced via eviction versus some of these other methods, and in particular, like, this point about intersectionality, I think, is incredibly important too, because one thing that I would like to do with this data is look at rates of take up by demographic characteristics, because in my qualitative work, talking to people who are going through an eviction, it's like a lot of people who are experiencing domestic violence and medical emergencies. And then it's like, oh, your solution is to go to the courthouse, like people don't want to do that. And if, or have, are facing cognitive issues like doing that, right? And so that you're dealing with, stigma and all sorts of learning, like the concept of administrative burdens is maybe something that you might be looking into. It's just like a way to understand like the barriers that people face when they're trying to access a government program, and just keeping that in mind. Like if you're offering something through the government, it'll have some of those costs attached to it if people try to access. Yeah.
Hello. Okay, so what I got from the talk, a lot about how computational physics science, so addressing particular policy to access problems. But I wonder if you could maybe expand a little bit more about the qualitative angles or qualitative applications like interior research. I think what I presented. And the reason I ask is precisely because of this issue of forward displacement rates. We talked about the comparative analysis problem, eviction rate, costs of eviction, procedures changing, what those things mean. So in certain jurisdictions, right, eviction rate, it might be used for rent options. One of the reasons it is so high here in forward displacement is because they're not using the threat, they're actually moving. It's not to paying rent. But we won't know that unless we, for example, have someone talking to landlords about it. Right? So I'm just curious about how that works.
So for the audience, the question is about what's the role of qualitative research in addition to quantitative research?
Sure, I'll go ahead and answer that, and then we can. So in my view, and I think we've seen this in a lot of areas of social science, is that qualitative work is like very foundational to developing theory and identifying like what are the questions that we should be asking about evictions, right? So I mean, the reason all of our research has been in part motivated by an in-depth ethnography, that, you know, was very famous because it was telling people stories, right? And so it's very powerful in terms of communicating, and it also is just really helpful for generating hypotheses. At the same time, you know, that research really got into the policy sphere when we started putting some numbers around things, because you can show policymakers graphs and say, here's what's happening in your community at scale. And so, like, you know, my opinion is that you can't have one without the other. If you do only, like, you know, even if your career is focused entirely on quantitative social science, it's still really valuable to read the qualitative stuff and vice versa. So that's what I've seen in this eviction stuff, is that there's been a really good interplay of both. And that's why we know more about evictions than we did 10 years ago.
I would just add that it's almost the training data to our research. You know, it's the qualification of what we're seeing. And I've done quantitative statistics most of my career. I'm like, man, it's really at the qualitative part. Without the story, you're not going to get far. And there's a slide I didn't show about what I call the three-legged stool of effective policy, which is, you know, you need advocates because you need their story. That's the qualitative piece of the motivation. They actually have better research questions than we can come up with. I don't know if that's surprising. You also need academics like us to convey and compile the evidence, and, you know, and then you need policymakers to design it and bring it forward. And I'll never forget the statement the attorney told me one time. He's like, somebody's going to listen to the advocate, the PhD, or the attorney. Our job is to bring those people to the front so that we can have effective change, even in an era like this administration. So I don't believe we're going to break orbit on new research without interdisciplinariness like that. And the qualitative piece is, it's paramount.
Thank you all so much. I mean, we've hit time essentially, but if you have questions or you want to meet with our speakers, please join me now in thanking them for their presentation. There we go.